Utah.js online talk series. If you can believe it, this is our 9th consecutive year bringing you the Utah.js conference. Now, usually we gather as about 500 developers, we have lunch provided, we have 30 speakers on the schedule, we have parties, we have all kinds of fun stuff. But this year, we can't legally do any of that stuff. All I can say is, thank you 2020, you are shaping up to be a great year. So we put out our request for talks before the global pandemic struck, and so we had lots of good talks to choose from. For this talk series, we chose what we thought were the 4 best talks with input from the community. We're giving you 1 talk per week for 4 weeks. Now, you're welcome to chat with each other. We have a chat feature on the website that we're using to deliver the conference this year. And as you do so, we need to remind you that you should be abiding by the code of conduct that everyone agreed to when they registered. All right, what else do I need to tell you? Oh, yes. We have some fantastic Utah.js merchandise available for sale this year. You can get cell phone cases, socks, tote bags, mugs, and yes, even face masks. All you have to do is click on the merchandise link on the website where you're watching this video. So, this week is the first of 4 talks in our series. Today's talk is by Cory Brown, and it's titled The Miseducation of CSS. Let me introduce Cory, and then we'll turn the rest of the time over to him. Cory is a staff engineer and front-end manager at Nav. Formerly, Cory worked for Jane and for the LDS Church and National Geographic. Cory has been writing JavaScript code for about a decade. He loves gaining and disseminating knowledge, especially about JavaScript and functional programming. Cory says, if you look at the avatar of him on the website, the answer to your question is yes, that is LeVar Burton standing by him. So please, join me in welcoming Cory Brown, presenting the miseducation of CSS. Now, remember, right after the talk, stick around. We're going to have a Q&A with the speaker.
Hello. So before I get started, I have something of a tradition where all of my introductions for conferences, I start with a little bit of Gaelic. So to begin, Fesker Ma, everyone. It's Misha Cory. Hami Agubur Ak Nav, and just a parenthetical, we are hiring front-end and back-end engineers. So if you're interested or know someone who is, please hit me up on Twitter. Marin Lidier, agus manager Erson and frontend. Agus Falchagu, the miseducation of CSS. By me. So I want to jump right in, and we're going to talk a little bit about CSS and about how we kind of misunderstand it. So to begin with, I want to talk, what do these guys have in common? So OO CSS, BIM, SMAC, Sweet CSS, Atomic CSS, Bootstrap, Tailwind. They all have something in common. 2 things, in fact. First, they all seek to help us manage complex CSS. They seek to help us tame it. And the second thing that they do is they all fail at it. Now, to be fair, actually, that's not entirely true. It's not these wonderful libraries and frameworks that fail. It's actually us. We're the ones that are failing or causing these to fail. And it's precisely because we're missing some key information about CSS. We haven't put that into our head. It is likely that CSS is not what you think it is. When I first started doing front-end development, we were taught that there are 3 primary areas of concern. That you have structure, you have style, and you have behavior. And these are controlled by file types. HTML controls our structure, CSS controls our style, and JavaScript is our behavior. And this was super. This was great. This meant that we didn't have to give any thought about what we were dealing with at any given time. If it was a JS file, it was behavior. If it was HTML, it was structure. And if it was CSS, it was style. And that was it. And this was brilliant. And it made a lot of sense. It made so much sense, in fact, that nobody thought to actually question it for quite a long time. But soon, an age of componentization came into being on the front end. It was ushered in, and mainly by the initial work of standardizing the web components specification, but also with frameworks such as React and Vue. And in fact, this was such a big deal that famously the Angular team, who was already in the midst of a big rewrite for Angular 2, famously in the middle of that stopped and pivoted and completely re-architected what they were doing at the time to be componentized. So it was kind of a big deal, and it really shook up the industry. Component orientation actually came to CSS in the form of several methodologies, including OOCSS, BEM, and SMAX, and many others. And the ideas of these systems were that they would bring this modularity and this componentization that we saw on the JavaScript side into CSS. And they did this primarily through discipline. So it laid out some rules and expected you, the engineer, to apply those rules. Soon, however, CSS and JS came into being. And it compelled the same thing, but this time through code. So it wasn't only through discipline, but enforcement through code. So we have things like style components and JSS and Glamour and Emotion and all these CSS and JS things. And you throw in other tools and technologies like Sass and CSS variables. And what we have is what we would expect to be CSS nirvana. We would expect, with all of this available to us, we have achieved transcendence. And yet, why do we still struggle with CSS? At scale in particular. It's almost as if we're missing some key ingredient, some very important piece of context that has eluded us so far. To be fair, what I'm about to talk to you about is nothing new. It has been hinted at and implied and at times actually outright stated since at least 2009 when Nicole Sullivan introduced OOCSS. And she talks about this specifically. What I hope to do is not really bring forth anything new, or not revolutionary anyway. What I hope to do is take these things that have already been talked about and tweak it just a little bit so that we understand it from a different perspective and that we can, in turn, fundamentally change the way we approach our CSS and get past this barrier that we have when we're doing CSS at scale. To properly understand, though, we need a few things. We need some background, we need some context, and we need a correction. So first, the correction. I said before that when I began learning front-end development that there were three main areas of concern: HTML structure, style, and behavior, and these were controlled by HTML, CSS, and JavaScript respectively. But this was actually never quite true. The truth is that, certainly CSS controls style, JavaScript controls behavior, but in actuality, structure is not controlled by HTML. And that is because HTML is not actually structure, or at least it's not visual structure. What HTML is semantic structure. What that means is that HTML describes the relationship of objects inside the document. It says that this is a child of that, or that this element represents an external resource, or is an item in a list. But it actually does nothing at all to express how we consume that information. HTML is fundamentally for machine reading, for parsing, for understanding the makeup of a document, not consuming it visually. So let me give you an example to illustrate this. Imagine we have a digital copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy up on our web page. This document, this book, it has all the right semantics, the HTML, it's marked up, we have cantos, we have the title, we have the publisher, it's all there in our HTML. However, we've put a display none on the body. Well, we still have our semantic structure. It's still there, right? It still describes all the same things it described before, but we are not consuming any of it visually. Conversely, consider the many experiments that have been done recently in CSS art. So here we have an example. This is Louise Flanagan's CSS rendition of Vermeer's The Girl with the Pearl Earring. And it's incredible. It is really difficult to believe this is done in purely CSS. It is beautiful, awe-inspiring. But the divs that make up this canvas have nothing whatsoever to do with how we consume this information. We have a bunch of divs. Sure, we can throw class names on here, but they don't contribute anything at all to semantic meaning. What we have is a whole bunch of divs, which describe nothing at all. We don't look at that div tree and say, oh my gosh, that's the girl with the pearl earring. That's amazing. No, we consume it like this. So you can see there is a definite difference, a separation between the semantic structure of our documents and the way in which we visually consume them. There are a lot of add-on benefits to having those have a loose relationship, but they are absolutely not necessary for us to have them. So if HTML does not provide a sense of visual structure, then I ask you, how do we attain it? Turns out that actually CSS is doing double duty. It is providing our style and also our visual structure. Without understanding this key aspect, we are doomed to continue to wrestle with CSS at scale because we will continue to apply our structure incorrectly. That's the secret. Now, I say that's the secret, but it's actually been right in front of our faces this whole time. We've just been too busy not noticing to notice. If you go to the Mozilla documentation under CSS, it's right there in the introduction. That while HTML is used to define the structure and semantics of your content, CSS is used to style it and lay it out. So we should have known all along that CSS is pulling double duty, but we haven't been treating it that way. And it turns out that CSS pulling double duty is not a problem. Because if you think about any other development environment, there's typically only one language that we have to deal with any of our concerns. And the way that those development environments work is you apply an architectural pattern to it. Maybe that's MVC or MVVM. You apply OOP, object-oriented programming, or functional programming. All of this is intended to manage the concerns that our applications have and keep them separated and discrete and isolated, componentized. So having CSS do two things, we can manage it. We can take those same architectural principles and we can apply them here. But I want a word of caution real quick. If we stop now, we have not learned anything that hasn't already been talked about. There's no new information for us now, nothing to change our behavior. In fact, left with only this information, what has tended to happen is that a bunch of style components get created and someone eventually has an idea, thinks it's brilliant, says, aha! I'm going to make a layout component. I'm going to create a grid component. A flex component. Some kind of component that drives the display and the layout of our design. And this is natural, right? This is normal. This is obviously where we go from here, because if CSS does both style and structure, then why not create style components and structure components? This has been debated quite a bit. I've heard a lot of people talk about this. In fact, very, very recently, people much smarter than me have been discussing how certain aspects, particularly aspects related to layout, should be banned from CSS. We should just not use them. They should be taken out. They're considered harmful, such as margin. Or even that we should go back to the days of doing spacer GIFs, put that display information in our semantic structure in HTML, and just do spacer divs so that we can gain that visual display. I contend this is a huge mistake. And I feel confident in saying that because I have gone down that path. And that is the path to the dark side. Now, in all seriousness though, layout components, they simply complicate things. They add extra markup and destroy the underlying semantic structure and value that our HTML has. When we trade off display structure for semantic structure or vice versa, we are doing ourselves a disservice. The semantic structure that our HTML provides is necessary and important to accessibility, to things like screen readers, to things like web crawlers. We do not want to sacrifice that. However, we also need layout. Without that, we get this div soup that we had back in the old days. Let me suggest a simple mantra that will allow us to retain our semantic structure while also giving us the freedom and the flexibility to apply visual structure, visual display in whatever way we want. And that is this. Components style themselves, and they position their immediate children. This is a very simple mantra that if we embed it in our brains, and if this is how we think about CSS going forward, we will be able to create highly reusable, highly scalable CSS and not run into these walls and ceilings at scale. Now, a mantra is only as good as our understanding of it. So let me come back to this for a minute. It's only as good as our understanding of its implications. So I want to provide some clarity on the implications here and see what it means in practice. What is style and what is position? I'd like to go in and it'd be really fun to have a discussion, cross-discipline discussion about the difference between decoration and art and structure in terms of architecture and building design. That would be a lot of fun, but for the purposes of time, let's just think about the box model in CSS. And we could say that anything border box and inward, anything that only affects border box and inward is style. Everything else is structure, is display or position. Okay? Border box inward, style. Everything else, position. It's another easy thing to remember. So I want to do a quick pop quiz. I'm going to list off some CSS rules, and you're going to tell me, is that CSS rule style or is it position related? Okay, so when I come through, just call them out. We'll get through them. Color. Is color style or position?
Style.
Style. It is. Padding. Style or position?
Style.
Style, because it's inside the border box. Margin.
Position.
It's position, because the margin box is outside of the border box. Well, what about the border itself? Style or position?
Both. No, it's style.
Style? Style. Display.
Style.
Well, anyone disagree?
Position.
Oh, it's a trick question. It depends. Display is a weird one. It depends on the value you give it, whether it's style or position. Flex. Are we talking about style or position? Any of the flex properties?
I'd say
Position.
Position. Grid.
Position.
Position. One last one, width and height.
Position.
It feels
Position. But let me talk about width and height for a minute. It has been my experience, and I cannot account for it, that while it's obvious to everyone that width and height is in fact position, yet we always apply it directly to the component. Not always. We often apply it directly to the component. We say in our minds, well, yes, it's position, but this component, its whole purpose is to be this size. So I'm going to make it this size and embed it into the definition of the component. This is a mistake. This is a violation of the principle, of the mantra, that components style themselves and position their immediate children, because I guarantee you that just because in this case it should be this size, you're going to want to use that same component in a different size. Or you're going to refactor your application. It needs to be a different size or different sizes. So don't fall into the trap of assuming that width and height, that your component needs to be this width and height because that's how it's defined. Let the component that consumes it define that. So what does this actually look like, though? How do we write code like this? I want to contend, oh wow, that when we write code like this, there's an easy way for it to be illustrated, okay? And I want you to stay with me because this can get controversial. There are a number of methodologies out there that swear that you steer clear of this at all costs. And I'm going to say, nonsense. This is integral to you creating scalable CSS. And that is this. There we go. The immediate child selector. This, more than anything else, ably visualizes what we're accomplishing here. It shows the mantra in code that components style themselves. Our style rules come up above the ampersand there, above the immediate child selector, and they position their immediate children like this. Positional CSS goes here, style CSS goes up there. This is a great visual representation in code of the mantra. I want to look at that a little bit more. Let us mess around with this a little bit. Let's imagine here that we have a component, this orange thing here. And in that component, there's a button. We, the front engineer, are tasked with making sure that this button lives in the right place. So we go into our code, and we go to our button, and we say, all right, that's easy. I know that our button needs to be two M's from the top, 1 M from the side. We put that in our button component, and we say, nailed it, right? This is exactly what we wanted. Commit it, get it approved, merge it, we're done. However, as we go on, new features get added, and we have another component. And then this time, it's actually going to use multiple buttons. The problem is we throw our button in there, and now we've dragged this positional context along with it. So we have a button that is 1 M from the side, but the next button is now 2 M's from the last one, which is probably not what we want. In this case, let's say they need to be right next to each other. It doesn't really matter. This is not meant to be a good design because I'm not a designer. But to illustrate that there are contextual differences between how we use these things. So we can go through some process. We can say, all right, well, then how about the buttons when it's the last of type? We get rid of the margin left, but we got to have it on the first one. So the first type, we actually get the margin left back on. If it's only 1 in there, And then we start to realize, no, that's still not working because we have all this problem. So maybe we decide, I know what we'll do. We'll pass in a prop or an attribute to the button to say, hey, am I in line or am I not? And then we're just now we're shoveling more context to it. This is problematic. This is how we create unscalable CSS. Instead, if we follow our mantra and we get rid of all this garbage, and our buttons just kind of sit there until our container decides what to do with them, and we come down and say, oh, okay, our container, the button, in our first container, our button needs to be, well, in this case, one in from the top and one in from the left, just as an example. You see, when we applied this to our top component, our bottom component is unaffected. It has a different context. This is what we want. This component, the bottom component, knows how it wants its children to lay out. The top component knows how it wants its children to lay out. The children do not know this. It is not important to them. So here, I think this demonstrates really nicely the value of the immediate child selector. But let me go a little bit farther and suggest one more thing. And that is that the creators of CSS, or rather the authors of the specification of CSS, actually have recognized this mantra as well, that components style themselves and position their immediate children. And as any good specification or language author does, they try to prevent foot guns. Now, because it's the web, we can't go back and fix mistakes that have made in the past, but we can, when we introduce new things, make sure they're done correctly. And that's exactly what they've done. If any of you have used the grid, CSS grid stuff, you may have noticed that a lot of these grid properties directly affect their immediate children. When we apply a display of grid to a component, and then we say, all right, justify content, align content, those rules do not apply to the container in which we are applying them. This is not justify content to the card. The card is not the content, right? The immediate children are the content, and it applies these rules to them. And you'll notice it is the immediate children. It is not any like grandchildren or deeply nested children. It is only those immediate ones. So the CSS authors have recognized this, and they're building it into the language. But because this doesn't do absolutely everything we need, if we understand this idea as well, we can take that knowledge and we can apply the existing CSS rules that we have that affect position in a way that is far more scalable and in line with the language itself. So, in conclusion, I want to reiterate and remind you all of the mantra. That components style themselves, and they position their immediate children. To understand that a little bit better, we know that anything that affects only the border box inward on an element, we can call style. And everything else, we call position. Finally, don't fall into the trap of thinking, I'll just build some layout components. Because you will undermine your semantic structure of your HTML and sacrifice that for poor positional structure. You can do better. We've seen better. Top of leaf. Any questions?
Thank you, Cory, for that excellent talk on the miseducation of CSS. I feel much less miseducated now. And thank you for joining us for this Q&A. So we've collected here a few questions from some folks who have seen the talk, and I'd like to now ask you these questions.
Awesome.
Okay. The very first question is, how do we identify extraneous elements such as extra divs that should be removed from the structure?
Yeah, so I mean, I touched on this a little bit in my talk, but I'm kind of afraid I might have made it come across as dismissing this concept. Um, Talk briefly about like how HTML provides a semantic structure, and moved off like, well, that's not really the visual structure that we care about when we're dealing with CSS, but semantic structure is still incredibly important. It's what gives efficaciousness to our accessibility tools and other things like that. Like it's incredibly important. And like extraneous divs and things like that are just kind of clutter and cruft in that space. So maybe rather than kind of setting it aside, saying that's actually a fourth concern. You have the structure, the style, and the what does JavaScript do? The behavior. The other is like a meaning, and we have to give that thought when we're looking at our HTML, the stuff that we use. So if you look at some HTML and says, is that providing any meaning? And if it's not, it's probably a good candidate for removal, or at minimum, like repurposing. Maybe it's an article. Maybe it's not a div.
Got it. Cool. You mentioned in your talk that some people consider margin to be harmful. I don't think this is a universally held opinion, but can you share why those people think that and what your personal view is on it?
Yeah, it's an understandable conclusion, I think, to come to if we're missing this piece of information I talk about in the talk, and that is that CSS is meant to play the role of layout as well as style. And if we don't create this clear separation of those concepts in our minds when we're thinking about applying CSS, and we apply a rule like margin to an element, like directly to an element, then that fundamentally makes that element less portable. If we try to move it around to a different context, we are pulling contextual information around with it. And so you go back and you try to refactor. It's like, oh, I'm going to take this component and I'm going to move it over here. And you drag with it all the context that you had from the layout before. It makes that really difficult to manage when you're refactoring. So it's not that, my opinion is not that margin and layout type rules in CSS are harmful. It's that when we apply them directly to an element, we are applying context, and applying context directly to an element, that's what's harmful. So you can use things like margin as long as you're applying it only within a context. And that's why I use the child sibling selector. So, because that is the definition of the context that you're in right now.
Cool. So next question is, in light of style and position, how do you name containers?
Yeah, so it gets, when I've seen this applied across different teams, you end up pretty quickly with components or like little wrapping components that are named such and such a wrapper, or styled this, or whatever it is, that kind of distinguish it between here's the component that I'm actually dealing with, and I need something to hold it all together, so I'm going to call it my component wrapper, or styled component, or something like that. I don't love those. I don't think it's very expressive, but I feel like that's more of a question of naming convention that could go across your entire application, rather than something that's a particular concern that is created by this methodology. I'm not sure I have a really good answer, because I think teams kind of need to decide that on their own, or have some kind of like context. And it goes well beyond this methodology, I think, also.
Cool. All right. Next question. This is about the display attribute. And the question is, in what situations would the display rule be considered style and not position?
Yeah, so that was kind of a trick question in the quiz that I did, right? Where I said, is display, the display rule, is that a style or position kind of concern? And I said, well, it depends. And it does depend. There are, but you can think about it. I said that a style rule is anything that affects only the border box inward. And a position rule is everything else. And you don't want to apply position rules directly to an element. You want only components only style themselves. They position their immediate children. So a rule like display none definitely affects outside of the border box, right? It affects everything around it. It can change the flow of the document. However, a display rule like display grid or display flex, it changes the context of stuff inside. It now begins to affect its children, and it doesn't actually change what happens beyond its border box. So depending on the rule that or depending on the value applied to the rule of display, it can act as either a style or a positional concern.
Cool. All right. Next question. If you follow this methodology, is there any value to using other methodologies like BEM or OOCSS?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because most of many of our applications are already going to have some sort of methodology applied to it, or a library or something like that. And I'm certainly not suggesting. I would never suggest that we should throw away whatever we're using completely and start over with something else, especially if it's just So, but there are some methodologies that work really well with this concept, this mantra that I have, that I've talked about. It's not really my mantra. And ones that work less well with it. And it's really interesting when you go through and kind of think about it. So something like BEM actually works really, really well with this concept that I've talked about: components style themselves and position their immediate children, because you already have the concept built into that. You have block element modifier. The element is the child, the block is the container. But then you have things like OOCSS, which is in many ways the spiritual ancestor of this mantra, right? It from the outset identified essentially the same thing. Some things are position, some things are style. But then at that point, it kind of goes off and says, so you should have these classes that are style that you can mix in with your position stuff. And that is not compatible with the mantra I'm talking about. So it's something you have to kind of consider on a case-by-case basis. But some of these pre-existing methodologies work really, really well with the mantra I talked about.
Cool. So the next question is a follow-up to what we just asked, which goes like this. It sounds like we can still use these libraries, referring to BEM or OOCSS or other implementations of them, but that we should just use the classes that position the components from their parents instead of baking the position into the component. Is that a right approach?
So, I mean, I suppose that you could take the concept and apply that to the HTML, right? If you said, okay, I have these collection of class names that are style only, and these collections of class names that are position only, and I'm only going to apply the position classes to the content of my components and the style to the component themselves. But I'm afraid that is too kind of convention-y, right? It becomes very, very easy to not do that. I would, if it were me, I'd probably recommend against that. Like, it's not that we want to just apply the classes that these tools provide. I kind of think if it's very class name oriented, in that sense, it's probably not the best compatibility fit for this methodology. Now, BEM, which does fit really, really well with it, you could apply those classes that way. That works great. But it's not simply a matter of, oh, I have these classes and I can apply them in a particular thing. I think it is really important, in my experience, in the few years that I've been doing this with different teams, it is actually really important to utilize the immediate child selector when you're doing your CSS. That describes what's happening. So,
got it. Cool. So next question. If we were to ask ourselves, should this apply to all components? Is that question really a proxy for, is this a style or a position concern?
Right. Yes, probably, maybe. You could, I mean, that's something, I think that's a good question to always be asking. And what that does is that helps us think in terms of portability and reusability. So yeah, ask that question. Does this style apply to all instances of this component? And if it does, then great, you can put it in there, hard code it. But just because the answer is no doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a display concern, right? Because think of a button. If you have uh, a primary and a secondary kind of button, you might have a different color for those. But color is definitely not positional in nature, right? So in that case, it's a piece of context that needs to be passed in via like a prop or a class name if that's kind of the way you're set up, but it's not positional in nature. So I think honestly the best way to decide is this rule position or is this rule style is really to think about the box model. If it is a thing that affects only the border box inward, then it is a style rule. If it affects beyond that, anything else, it's a position rule.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is about existing applications. And the question is, how could we, like, what's an approach we could use to migrate our existing applications toward these techniques?
Yeah, and that's going to be a case-by-case basis, because like if you already have an existing tool set or methodology that you're using that is more or less compatible with this methodology, and you've decided you want to move to this methodology and you're not there, it'll be easier if you're using something compatible like BEM, and a little harder if you're using something incompatible with CSS or something like that. So it's a decision that I think every team is going to have to make as to whether or not it's even as to the degree of difficulty to doing it. But the migration should be relatively easy, more particularly if you're using CSS and JS. That's actually going to be a lot easier, because you can say, oh, I'm just going to start now. And any new thing can just be implemented that way. And then whatever you have for a migration path, because we always have a long tail of old models that we don't no longer follow that we need to clean up. So whatever you have for migrating off of those old things are probably applicable here too. You can just say, every time you touch this file, it has to be clean, or whatever it is that the team has decided to do. I don't think there's anything particular special that is unique to this that would be different than any other thing that you're moving toward or away from. That's my thought.
Cool. Okay, last question. Have you seen this approach work effectively at scale within an organization? And the follow-up is, you showed some compelling examples, and I wonder how well it scales when there are dozens of engineers working in the same code base.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I have been following this model for about 5 years now, in various different sizes of teams and applications, and it's so far for me has been universally useful. Universally has bettered the code I've worked in, and it's because I think what this fundamentally does is it makes components more portable, and it's that portability that makes it scalable across not only use cases, but also across the number of engineers that are kind of working in that space. So I haven't run into any problems at all across a handful of different team sizes and whatnot. But I'm one person, and I haven't done an extensive study on whether or not people are doing something similar and what they've run into. However, I will see probably the best example of why this scales really well across any size of team is the thing that I talked about kind of toward the end of the talk, and that is that the CSS specification writers themselves have begun to move or have had many. We have grid and we have flex and we have things like that, and you'll see that model is precisely baked into the definition of these rules. This concept that this component is going to need to position its children, and so I'm gonna kind of bake that into there. So when we put in a rule that is grid related, like grid template columns or whatever, these things directly affect only the immediate children. That acknowledgement, I think, by the specification itself and by the authors of it, for me, is kind of proof enough that this is a workable, scalable solution.
Fantastic. All right. Cory, thank you for your talk. Thank you for your time today. if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Good question. So you can always hit me up on Twitter. I'm at unique name. I don't tweet much, but I do check my my responses. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'm also on the Utah.js Slack, so you can hit me up there too. I think that's the avenues. Yeah.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Cory.
Thank you. Appreciate it.